whenever we have, a customer who says, hey, I have a great piece of land open, in order to move that to something that is a useful project and something that can actually be a viable market-ready project, it requires a team that incorporates real estate, project developers, civil engineers, electrical engineers, design engineers, project finance groups. All of these merge together. And what I really like about the particular position of a design engineer is it's kind of the center point that has to tie all these threads together.
Today, we're going to dig into the gaps in knowledge around design engineering, specifically how important a skill set it is and how it can become a bottleneck to the kind of velocity we need in the industry. If you're looking at getting into the sector, it's a great entree to working with an EPC, an engineering procurement construction company, or a developer. It's a great place to learn the skills of this industry so that you can grow into a more senior or seasoned position. I'm going to talk today with the design engineering manager of New Leaf Energy, Phil Hofmeyer. So hope that you enjoy this. Stick around. And remember, you are what you listen to. Today, you can level up, or you can share with someone else that needs to level up their skills in this critical area of our industry. Here we go with the latest episode of Suncast. Hey, Phil, thanks for joining us. This is a really important topic, and I am super glad that I get a chance to talk with you about it. You've got a lot of experience in this area.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nico. Looking forward to talking with you about it.
Indeed. I think that it'd be really important to set the stage for folks who maybe don't understand the role at all or the company that you work for. Could you tell us a little bit about New Leaf Energy, what it is that you all do in the marketplace, kind of where you sit in the overarching architecture of how projects come together, and then what you do as design engineering manager at New Leaf?
Sure, absolutely. So I'll try to keep it as high level as possible here. New Leaf Energy is a pure play developer. So we are a spinoff of a company that was Borrego Solar. That's been a long time power player in solar energy development. So about 2 years ago, we spun off as our own development company. And the reason why is we wanted to have a sharper focus on creating projects, moving them through the pipeline, and getting them ready for construction. So our role in the industry starts at project development teams going out, getting lease agreements with customers. These are generally not C&I projects. They're distributed generation, 5 megawatts and larger. We also have a utility scale division up to 450 megawatts. We operate in PV, distributed generation, wind, standalone storage, DC coupled projects. So we're moving all the different types of projects in kind of the green energy space forward, from generally green space, open ideas, getting land use permits.
Yeah.
We get interconnection agreement applications through. We de-risk projects so that we can sell effectively a construction level ready product. We bring it to about a 50% design set. We share that to IPPs who bid on our projects. They typically will take that process, bring it to an EPC, and then we have a full construction from that point forward.
Yeah.
So we end at the IPP kind of sale at about a 50% design set. So we're definitely a development company.
I love that. So just to help folks that maybe are unfamiliar with some of the vernacular, IPP is independent power producer. And the way that the development game works, is certainly now as everybody gets really specialized in their skills, is a company like New Leaf will go out and do what we call greenfield development. They'll acquire projects that are like in really super early stage, and they will apply their expertise at the diligence process, making sure that the project is in fact a good project and can get to ready to build, so that the long-term asset owners or asset owners, IPPs, can confidently acquire a project that they know is prepared properly for construction and can be built in the timeline projected, in the dollar amounts projected, and that they can operate an asset that gives them the return that is predicted. So independent development companies like New Leaf Energy are really, really important to ensuring that we can build a robust pipeline in the clean energy sector that is bankable. I think that's the underlying sort of thing here is, in order to take what can be kind of this soup of ideas, this morass of PowerPoints, and turn them into power projects, you need seasoned professionals like the folks at New Leaf who've been doing this for decades and have systems and processes in place. One of the important aspects of that, Phil, is that the development associates that go out in the field and literally are, looking at GIS maps, and they're trying to figure out where can we put solar, rely internally on teams of engineers, of which you manage, to help them address whether or not, and effectively how, the site can be utilized for deploying solar. Can you talk a bit about your role in that critical path process of determining whether or not a project is viable?
Yeah, that's a absolutely wonderful question, Nico. I would say the beauty of New Leaf Energy is we have a very well mapped out process that describes swim lanes between all the different players to make a project like this go forward. There is a lot of risk. Whenever we have, a customer who says, "Hey, I have a great piece of land open," wonderful. In order to move that to something that is a useful project and something that, can actually be a viable market ready project, it requires a team that incorporates real estate, project developers, civil engineers, electrical engineers, design engineers, project finance groups, all of these merge together. And what I really like about the particular position of a design engineer is it's kind of the center point that has to tie all these threads together into a really strong design where we can have a layout in CAD that visually represents that idea generation. We have production models that are run at the most sophisticated levels so that, as you said, they're bankable projects. In order to make sure they're bankable, they have to have production that goes along and that can be verified by that. They have to be sound from a utility perspective. So understanding the DC and the AC sides of the systems are really, really critical. And it has to be something that will work in the ground. So interaction with structural and civil engineers to make sure we're completely code compliant for a system that's going to last for, 20 to 30 years in the field. That's what the design engineering team integrates all of that information together and then has to speak to all these different teams in order to make sure that we're all on the same page. So what I love about design engineering is it incorporates so many different aspects of engineering, marketing, production. It's a really nice, integrated kind of position.
Yeah, and it requires sort of a well-rounded skill set. How large of a team is required to support development? I wonder, as well as you answer this, if you've been able to distill sort of what the support team is, what level of support is required on a per megawatt or per like 10, 20, 100 megawatt block basis, so that others who maybe are trying to think about building out their team would better understand, okay, given New Leaf's experience, and I'm going after, say 20 megawatts of pipeline, I probably would need sort of this size team.
So our typical project is a 5 megawatt project, 5 megawatt AC. It might be a little bit smaller, generally not too much larger.
Yeah.
And that will include, at least at New Leaf, we have a project developer. And the project developer is kind of the person responsible for shepherding the project through all the different phases. Very early stage, we have an interconnection coordination team that, if we have an open land area, we have to understand how that's going to tie into the utility. So we have an interconnection coordinator that speaks directly with the utility to make sure we understand, legally what we need to do in order to connect the system. And we'll have a drafting team that puts together a single line diagram and a pretty simple layout so that they can begin that conversation with the utility and establish a queue position and start the process for impact studies and things along those lines. We have an electrical engineer who will typically also work in collaboration with our coordinator and our drafting team. So our design engineers first touch a project when we do a simple CAD layout and a simple single line diagram for a project in concert with our electrical engineers. Then we kick in a real estate team because we have to establish a a letter of intent for a land lease agreement,
Right.
because typically we don't buy the property. The property will still stay with its current owner. We're just putting in a lease agreement for, however long. Let's call it
Yeah.
20 years. We then have to go into civil engineering. Our civil engineering team does a lot of the code reviews, and we have to establish things like endangered species, um, if we have jurisdictional wetlands, topography issues, site grading, noise ordinances, and they establish, if you will, the bounds of the project, things that we absolutely cannot
Yeah.
exceed in some way, shape, or form. That forms kind of the outer package for our design engineering team to come in and optimize the site.
Mm.
So we're looking at, what modules will be available, 2 years out from now.
Yeah.
We look at how best to optimize the site from, you know, code compliance, but also things like how tightly can we pack the modules? What are the spacing? What are the road requirements? And then we do our initial layouts there. And then that starts again feeding into a cost estimation team.
Is that
We
the
have
first or the second time? I'm trying to keep track here. First or second time that the design engineering team is then engaged by the development team?
This is our second time.
Right. Okay. Thought I was
Yeah,
following that. Okay.
yeah. So we actually go through phases of de-risking a project. We don't go all in on day one. So
Right.
we kind of do. It's kind of like lean manufacturing, if you will.
Hmm.
It's you want to do the right amount of engineering at the right stage to properly de-risk it to go to the next stage of development.
Right.
So our initial one is utility interconnection. If we don't have a strong queue position, we really don't have a good project. If we have, we do an initial design, which is a really light touch. Let's call it a 15% design. That's our first pass to say, is this a project that is sufficiently de-risked for us to continue to move forward? Or did we find some major barrier, like maybe there's a wetland that we just cannot get enough buildable space
Yeah.
around it that didn't show up without, a really good kind of desktop screening. So, in a situation like that, no, that's great. It's a wetland. Let's leave it as is. It's doing an
Mm-hmm.
environmental purpose. We
Right.
don't need to, overwrite that.
Yeah.
So our initial designs will kind of highlight high level risks. Once we get through that stage, we're now taking a project very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
So once we get to the permitting phase, it's kind of throw everything that we have at it internally.
Right.
And so this is where our civil engineering team does incredible due diligence. We're now working with the local planning boards or whoever happens to have jurisdiction, whoever the AHJ is on, that particular region. We're working with the landowner to make sure all of their needs are met. And this whole time we'll be doing design, iterations and
Iterations.
modifications to make sure it's as good as we can make a system.
How many design iterations would you say a typical 5 megawatt system goes through?
3 for our company.
Okay, 3. And when you mentioned the civil engineering team, et cetera, are those folks all in some way under your purview as design engineering manager?
So we're all on an engineering team. So we have my equivalent level I'm a design engineering manager, so I oversee specifically design engineers. We have my counterpart on our civil engineering team, and our collaboration is so tightly intertwined.
Yeah.
It's so important. We're in the exact same CAD files.
Yeah.
We're referencing work one another does. So
Could you disintermediate for the audience then the difference
yes, of course.
in terms of what the civil engineering team is focused on versus the design engineering team?
Yeah, it's somewhat nuanced here.
Mm-hmm.
So our civil engineering team is really focused on the bounds of the project. So what I mean by that is, what is the floor of the project in terms of the topography of the site? What are our limits there that are allowable by code requirements or local laws? What are the bounds in terms of the property boundaries and the setbacks that are required? What are the jurisdictional code requirements for that local town? So if we have a noise ordinance, if we have a fence height restriction, if we have a total module height restriction, they're really focused on what is legally allowed to occur.
Right.
Once we establish those legal bounds, our design engineering team says, okay, given this kind of,
I got my sandbox.
yeah, and the sandbox gets stranger as time goes on, right?
I can
We're
imagine.
past these like really big open sites, and now we're in these like really constrained, confined sites, which I will say it makes a really good design engineer. This is the easiest way for me to sort out a good design engineer from one who needs a lot more experience, is the way that they work in a constrained nature
Yeah.
and the way that they can optimize that site. And so, um, that container that we have to work within, we now have to make a profitable and viable system.
Hmm.
And that's what our design engineering team does. They're tweaking their layouts. They're spending a lot of time. They're understanding if I move a road to, this spot, or if I move my equipment pad here, it's going to have these rippling effects in terms of production and cost. And a really good design engineer that's intuitive, a newer design engineer, they have to learn that through kind of brute force.
Yeah.
And so so we wrap up a really nice design. We'll do production modeling and a cost model. We pass that back to our project development team, and they make a decision. Is this a project we're really going to go forward and sell, or is it one that we probably can't make enough to make it a viable
Yeah.
project?
Have you guys calculated how many man hours go into the prep up to that point, that decision of a go, no go? Like, because I'm curious at a development level, the amount of effort that is expended before you can actually say, yes, we're going to do this project.
I'll say it's difficult to do in terms of actual man hours,
Yeah.
because the man hours really do vary project by project and
Mhm.
jurisdiction by jurisdiction. We do have attrition rates. So, like, as a percentage, if I think of our business as a funnel, how many projects come in at the top of the funnel in order to
Yeah.
spit one all the way out at the bottom?
Yeah.
And so, you might get a really high attrition rate to start off with,
Mhm.
40% attrition rate that never make it past our first initial design.
Right.
We might get a 30% attrition rate on top of that, which then says these are only the projects that we're going to take seriously.
Right.
So, one of the reasons why, uh, I would say one of the beauties of New Leaf Energy is our job is taking that time risk
Hmm.
on a lot of projects to begin that an EPC cannot afford to do. In
Yeah.
EPC, there's no way they could afford to take the risk of
That makes sense.
vetting so many early stage projects, which is
That makes
why.
sense. And that's why project development team companies exist.
Exactly right. Yeah. So I think of us as like the architects, right?
I'm actually really glad that you make that distinction, because someone as a coming out of college or coming out of some other field that's thinking to themselves, I love this engineering practice. Where should I be positioning myself? There's a distinction in how you are going to work at a development company versus an EPC company. A very, very different job.
Absolutely right. In fact, when I screen people, that's one of my very first questions is, how do you envision yourself?
Hmm.
Um, I like people, I'm excited to hire lots of people who want to work,
Hmm.
but I want to make sure it's the right fit. I would say a design engineer is somebody who loves exploring unexplored territory. If you
Mm.
if you look and say, I'm happy to do iteration, I'm happy to be wrong, I'm happy to
Yeah.
learn from that, and I'm happy to become stronger,
I want feedback.
with like pure imagination. I
Yeah.
love it. If it's somebody who wants really detailed, like, I want to lay out an equipment pad with exact XY coordinates of a conduit run, you're much better off at an EPC.
Yeah.
If that's like your comfort,
Because that's late stage. Yeah.
that's much later stage than what we do.
Yeah.
We're very much in the idea generation phase.
I love that. Really appreciate that you've contextualized it that way. I don't think I've ever heard it enunciated quite that way. And I think that's important. Where do these project timelines typically break down or get constrained from a process flow perspective? Like, what's the pinch point inside of New Leaf Energy typically?
Permitting. Um,
Permitting.
Permitting phase every single time. Not to like go too crazy on an analogy here, but if you're familiar with the Hubbard's curve of like peak oil,
Yep.
what was really interesting about um, that exercise that Hubbard did from Shell Oil was, looking at how gas wells would be developed over time.
Hmm.
And it wasn't so much how much oil might be out there, it's how easy is it to get to it and
To
how
find it.
large is it?
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So, and like what technologies are available that he couldn't foresee, in the 60s and 50s.
Hmm.
But at any rate, I think of it kind of the same way in solar development right now. is when we were thinking of solar development a few years ago, there were big open fields, everything was nice and square, there was plenty of room, relatively few constraints.
Hmm.
And at the same time, the permitting bodies, I'll say they weren't like wise to what we were up to. They didn't have enough experience to know what questions they should be asking. As time goes on, space is becoming more constrained, and local permitting agencies, state permitting agencies, utilities, they've had experience with these projects, or their neighbors have had experience with these projects. So now they start overlapping additional constraints, some of which may be intentional, some of which they might not have understood. Hey, if I put this in my local law,
Yeah.
this is the effect that we want to have, but really it's not having the effect that they intended to. So with us as a company, we often go into new markets.
Hmm.
As we go into new markets, we have to play the game of helping teach others what is a reasonable code to enact and for which reasons.
Yeah.
And so permitting for us a lot of times is a wild card. You might have a project that's going swimmingly, and then right at the last moment, you get something, like a new fire department that hasn't had experience with EMS training through one of these that
Yeah.
put up an immediate barrier that now sets you back 3 months
Yeah.
on something that might be a red herring issue. It might also be a very real issue as well.
How involved in permitting is your team, the design engineering team?
So I'll say we are peripherally involved. Our
Hmm.
civil engineering team and our project developers, they're the ones who typically go in to talk to the municipalities, talk to the landowners, and our electrical engineering team is typically coordinating with the utilities.
Yeah.
Where we are involved is because we are the integration of that information, we now have to respond. So if the town
Hmm.
overlaps a constraint, our civil engineering team will interpret it, and that we have to re-shrink wrap what the bounds of the project were, which means our design engineering team now
Yeah.
reimagines the site based on that new constraint. The same thing will be true on the utility side.
Yeah.
We find this a lot, particularly with battery storage sites that are a bit newer to a lot of the utilities. And because battery manufacturers are changing so rapidly their technologies all the time, it's really difficult to sync what the
Mm.
manufacturers have available with what the utility requirements are.
Yeah.
So as we learn those, we end up doing design revisions to make everything match. So
Makes sense.
again, our job is iteration. You cannot think, hey, I got it right. You always have to assume I have to get ready for the next change.
Yeah. Well, I hear that sort of at an organizational level, permitting is every time it is the pinch point. But it sounds to me like, if I can pull a layer back here, that internally everything still goes through a filter of another. Okay, we learn information, now we need to take it back to the design engineering team for another iteration. Am I intuiting correctly then that somehow the design engineering team becomes a choke point at some point in growth of a company?
From that perspective, I think you're dead on the money.
Hmm.
Because when we sell a project, it has to be constructible.
Mhm.
And so it has to be something that is consistent with the permit that we have in hand,
Right.
and it has to be consistent with our impact study and interconnection application.
Hmm.
The only way to do that in kind of a changing sea while you're continuing to move projects forward is design iteration. So our design engineering team is actually, I would argue, mm, slightly bloated. And the reason it's slightly bloated is exactly because of that pinch point. Is if you have a
Yeah.
project marketing date and you have a portfolio of 8 or 10 projects and you just got thrown a wrench in permitting where you now have to adjust projects that are out for sale in
Hmm.
order to be compliant with your permits, you have to get that work done immediately. And
Yeah.
you can't overwhelm 2 people to do that.
Right.
So our team has like a regional strategy. We have 5 different regions that our teams work in. So we will beg and borrow from a different region if they're a little slower this week.
Makes sense.
Maybe Mid-Atlantic took a little bit of a rest, but our New York team is on fire.
Yeah.
We have to beg and borrow from one another. Um,
Yeah.
so again,
Is
yeah, that being
I
flexible as a design engineer is really, really critical.
On a regional level, how many design engineers do you typically task to support a regional team?
Our typical team will be anywhere from a slow region of 2 design engineers
Mhm.
to a region that is really
Robust.
on fire where we will have 7 to 9 engineers.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Just design engineers.
Just design engineers. Yeah.
Correct.
And just for context, how many developers does that
would
team
be in
support?
a market?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a little different.
I
It's a
know.
little different because we have wind, we have solar, we have energy storage. So if I
Fair.
were to kind of like blend it all
This
together,
is, yeah. So the caveat is that this is
it,
not going to apply to every development company.
correct. Yeah.
Right.
A typical market for us will have, let's call it 3 to 4 project developers who are also supported by an additional 2 or 3 associate project developers.
Right.
And so we can get into like
so
all
from
the
the
different
engineering
scales and
team's
ranks.
perspective, it's 7 people. So it's kind of 1-to-1.
Almost correct. And in fact, our design engineers almost have a 1-to-1 relationship from an interconnection perspective with a particular project developer.
I would not have
for
guessed that.
efficiency.
I would not have guessed that. But actually thinking back to one of my earlier career roles, the design engineering team was essentially 1-for-1 to our development team. I don't know if I ever put those two, that one, sort of 2 and 2 together on that.
And it's not perfect 1-to-1. Some markets are a little bit more, but there are definitely, most of our markets are very, very close to 1-to-1.
Got it. I appreciate that. Also, you caveated that New Leaf has over-indexed on intentionally on having capacity internally by having what you refer to as bloated, but like having enough slack in the system, so to speak, to know that you could accommodate for surprises, which are all too often more common than we would like. It brings up the question for me, which is sort of one of the core things that I felt that we'd probably get into in this conversation. I want to explore the nature of hiring for these specific roles and how difficult or not it may be for someone in your position to keep not just butts in seats, but talented butts in seats. Can you give me a sense of the nature of hiring in these roles, and maybe at the same time, the specific skills or experiences that you are looking for when you're hiring into your team?
Absolutely. It's one of my favorite topics. And in fact, our CEO, Dan Berwick, he's mentioned a few times that one of the most important jobs of a people manager like me is hiring the best talent that we can, and making sure that these connections are correct. So we have, let's call it 2 different levels of design engineers. We have beginning design engineers, they're design engineer 1 and 2, and then we have senior design engineers 1 and 2 at our company. It's incredibly easy to hire a design engineer, a DE 1 or 2. And I mean that in the best possible way. That candidate pool for us is very deep. And it's generally those who have a degree in some sort of engineering. It could be mechanical, it could be civil, it could be electrical, it could be environmental. It could also be these like quasi, not exactly engineering programs, but somebody who went through like an environmental science, program who has like an engineering bent, perfectly fine for this as well. And so those, I'm looking for somebody with desire and interest to learn, where they've got some exposure to it, and they're like, I want to do something positive for the world. Let's get on this renewable energy train. They come in, we onboard them. It's fantastic, and they'll be good as a generalist. It's somebody who wants to learn to explore this like box that I've been talking about, right? How do I explore it? How do I learn the terms? How do I kind of get my feet underneath me? And I love that like intro excitement of somebody getting into the field. We have like an ongoing position that's open because we always are looking for developing an internal talent stream like that. Somebody who maybe has 1 or 2 years experience, maybe doing some rooftop design or, something. Maybe they work some install over, a year or 2 or something. They make wonderful intro design engineers. What I've been describing though about our team is that they have a very integrative function of electrical engineering, civil engineering, maybe project development, maybe project finance. And what I said earlier on is that a really good design engineer understands if they make a change in a design, it affects all these different branches of engineering in some particular way. So what's really, really important for our team is to have very strong senior design engineers. They they understand all of the software in the market. They understand the production modeling side. They understand the cost economics. They're really comfortable with electrical design. The code makes sense to them intuitively. So every design is clear. We have a lot of tools and things, so it's not that they'll ever be wrong if using the tools correctly, but it's very different if you own that knowledge to understand very critically all the electrical pieces, all the mechanical pieces, and make sure that you're in compliance with civil engineering.
Phil, I know that in the conversations that I've had with development companies, the pain point around hiring is specifically in getting folks with the more senior skill set. Can you talk about the nature of that senior level hire, and maybe even sort of how does that role as the people manager in the organization make your job easier or harder on a week-to-week basis?
Sure. Hiring a senior design engineer is a very difficult challenge.
Mm.
First of all, it's in the term design engineer.
Mm-hmm.
So when you put that out in like the global market space, you're going to get a lot of people with, a software background in design engineering.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Who apply. So first of all, 80% of your candidate pool is applying for the wrong job. Another solid 15% of the candidate pool that comes in, they're applying for a senior design engineer as a personal stretch goal for themselves.
Oh, yeah.
They might have been, a design engineer for, let's call it 2 to 3 years, maybe 3 to 4 years even. And they're now applying to become a senior design engineer. And this is a really risky, from a hiring manager perspective, this is a really risky kind of individual to bring in. You might find somebody with a lot of experience, a lot of excitement, and by a lot, I mean a lot for somebody 3 to 4 years out in the industry.
Right.
That's a really tough position because senior design engineers, they must be leaders and they must be able to solve all of our complex problems across different markets almost instantaneously because of these late market pushes that we have to clear portfolios and of whatever hurdles they might have.
Yeah.
And
so what I heard you say is they have to be able to work independently and solve problems without oversight, meaning they can't have someone else checking their work.
Not as like a step-by-step of how do I do this next thing.
Mm-hmm.
There will definitely be a final check.
Right.
But that final check had better be like, we're dotting I's and crossing T's at that point, not going back to very fundamental pieces. And so hiring that stretch candidate, we do that occasionally, but it's a very, very, it's a long shot. I'll just put it that way. It's a long shot for the candidate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because the stakes are very high. We do also get some applicants that are very long tenured. Let's call it 10, 12, 14 years in the industry. And most of those have gone through the same kind of industry growth that I did. We did some residential work. We were doing like the whole thing where we're designing it, installing it, doing commissioning, O&M all at the same time. Moved up to like C&I. And a lot of times those who have that long tenured industry, their movement is different. They understand the electrical principles, they understand the mechanical, they understand the utility integration, but many of them will be coming into utility scale for the first time. So it's a different kind of challenge, but the systems inherently make sense from lots of different perspectives. And it's in that case, that's an easier transition to me in a lot of different ways for somebody.
So let's take that latter example first. Is it when you're transitioning someone with this understanding perhaps of the electrical and mechanical aspects of the project, but they're stepping up in overall project complexity and size? How does that skill gap impact timelines and efficiency, and how do you manage through that?
The first most obvious thing that people want to do is over-design systems on day one. Those who understand already where it's going, it's very difficult to understand what is as a development engineer where the risks occur. So
Right.
I'll go back to like right sizing their designs. They want to over design immediately on day one because they already know the endpoint. And
Hmm.
a lot of times, because of that, they miss some really big risks that they wouldn't have had to worry about on smaller projects.
Mm.
Um, much bigger land areas, much bigger, back and forth with the town or something like that, or with the governing bodies that we have to work with. So they want to jump right in and do kind of almost too much, too quickly, too soon.
Right.
And so it's almost holding them back a little bit and allowing them to think a little bit more broadly about sites. That takes a couple months and then they get it. As soon as they get it, like the light bulb goes on and they become just wonderful design
I'm
engineers.
glad you answered that
Wonderful.
because I was going to say, like, how long does that breaking in period typically take? A couple of
Yeah,
months.
yeah, it's like four really good projects where they get their hands slapped a little bit.
Yeah,
Not like really hand slapped, but
sure.
like just like, hey, let's just hold back a little bit here because these things are likely to happen. And once
Yeah.
they see it unfold that way, it makes sense and they get it.
So, so if we assume that we can't get where we want to go by doing the things we've always done, which is kind of hiring from our competitors and hiring people that already have these skill sets, but we have to train internally, where are the key gaps in knowledge or skills that you see from people that do come from more conventional engineering programs versus real experience in the solar industry that, if someone's listening to this, they might go, oh, okay, sweet. If that's a skill gap, how can I go fill that gap so that someone like Phil will hire me?
Number one, take any class you can on electrical code. There are
Mm,
so many of them that are out there that give you the fundamentals of the National Electrical Code.
yeah.
And
Tons of those over on HeatSpring, by the way. We'll link to those in the show notes.
there's lots of great examples that are out there. And that's one thing that like a typical engineering program will not train you to do. They'll
Yeah.
teach you like the fundamentals of electrical theory, let's say if you're in an EE program, but they don't apply that to something that I would argue is quote unquote practical in a solar design perspective,
Right.
which is linking the National Electrical Code to design philosophies. If
Mm.
I can have that conversation with somebody, I'm immediately attracted to them as a candidate. Um, where it's not a forced conversation. They just understand something like string sizing
Hmm.
and they get it. Um, I would argue the same. If you come from, like a structural engineering program, and if you can transmit that information by taking, a group of webinars on racking companies
Mm.
and understanding the way that something like fixed tilt versus single axis tracker versus maybe terrain following trackers, what that means from a mechanical perspective for a site. If I can have that conversation with somebody, it's again immediately attractive. So the beauty I would say about design engineering is you can take all these different engineering pathways and find an area that excites you, that you are specialized in, and become an expert in it. So if you come from an environmental background and you really want to understand stormwater mitigation, oh man, I'm sold. I'm
Yeah.
sold.
Are there software that are different in our industry than folks that are coming from other industries that you would suggest to folks, hey, either like figure out a way to brush up on these elements of the job?
Yeah, of course. So basic skills. I mean, if you can be an expert user in Excel, for instance, I don't know any company that's gotten away from Excel and
Right.
probably won't anytime soon. And not just somebody who can, like write in a simple formula, but actually be a power user in it. Incredibly beneficial because
Mm.
it bridges so many different gaps.
Yeah.
I would argue the same with AutoCAD. AutoCAD is the language that we use to speak in design engineering. I would argue we're not CAD drafters specifically,
Yeah.
but it's the language that we use to convey our information. So the more comfortable you are in AutoCAD, the better. There are very specialized softwares, like PVCase or something like that,
Yeah.
that it's okay, great. Take a webinar on it if you can.
Sure.
That's probably going to be taught internally up to some company CAD
Okay.
standards.
Got it.
So, exposure to those things is much better than fluency if you are new. If you're a senior design engineer, applicant and it's your first time, like, hey, what is PV-Syst? Um, that's going to be a stretch.
Yeah.
That you should have a pretty good expectation of
Good to know.
understanding about.
Oh, so I want to put a pin in really quickly because one of the things we talk about from a sort of a career path perspective when you're thinking about transitioning from maybe one domain of expertise or other field into the clean energy sector, what you want to look for in your resume are what Phil was pointing out as transferable skills. A lot of people don't think intuitively, I'm a super user, I'm a power user of Excel, and somehow that skill is transferable. It is. Similarly, because AutoCAD is a foundational engineering software for just about every engineering practice, being able to speak proficiently about your AutoCAD experience and understand that that is a transferable skill without understanding how to design a solar park is still nevertheless really important to be able to have that vernacular included in your resume even. Like you should be thinking in your resume in terms of transferable skills. What are the things that I've learned in my career that translate across any other type of engineering practice? So it sounds like the senior engineering role, in particular, design engineer, is not only the hardest to fill, but my guess is it's probably where we're having potentially high attrition levels. So I'm wondering, is that true? And why do you think that's true? Like, where are we losing folks that are potential senior design engineers? Are they getting stuck in specific roles or burned out, or are they moving into management roles like what you have? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's also really important is, senior design engineers, there is probably a shelf life there.
Mhm.
And it's after a while, right? A solar project kind of becomes a solar project.
Hmm.
There are differences, there are nuances. You can only do it for so long, quite honestly. I would argue.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times, you know, after a few years, you want to try something new. It could be as simple as changing companies. If you
Yeah.
change a company, you change the scene, it's enough of a breath of fresh air. So holding on to a senior design engineer for a few years, that's great. Holding on to them for 6, 7, 8 years is probably pretty unlikely
Mm,
because they're also focused on career progression. And that career progression might go into a management sector. It might even go to a totally different industry. It could also be you get pulled away from, hey, I've been doing solar for a long time. I'm really going to get into energy storage because maybe that's the next big thing.
right.
And so you get a lot of, maybe I'll also throw in one other there. If you're a senior design engineer on a team at a larger company, one of the other very attractive things that we see is a smaller company looking for the super senior design engineer, one person who can kind of do it all.
Yeah.
And then they can explore their own ability to set up a team, to kind of design their own standards. So there's an attractive nature to that as well for smaller companies to get like a real big rock star where they're willing to pay a pretty high salary for one person,
Hmm.
where otherwise you might have to have a smaller salary for, two or three others who would still not be able to integrate everything as seamlessly as one. So it is a difficult, number one, there are very few people out there who've been in the industry long enough
Yeah.
for the amount of growth that we're expecting to see of solar in the ground
Hmm.
in the upcoming years. There are very few people with that long, rich history as a design engineer. So it's very, very competitive if you happen to be one of them.
Yeah. I wonder, a couple of levels are, do we need more generalists versus specialists in the engineering nature of this work? And how do you as the engineering team manager think about the kind of internal training and reinforcement required to avoid this attrition?
We spend a lot of time, at least I do. When I interview people, I spend a lot of time right sizing the position to them.
Mm,
I'm
yeah.
much more interested in somebody who has an interest and an area in developing them in that particular one focused area. I think it's pretty unlikely now to train somebody to be the super generalist that kind of came about by force
Hmm.
for those who've been in the industry for, 18 years or 16 years or whatever it happens to be. Somebody who's newer on the team now, I'm probably going to try to shape them based on their own interests into a specialist
Hmm.
that might deal with racking as a design engineer. Where
Yeah.
that is their focus, that's kind of where they become the internal team expert. They become the go to on that because it excites them.
Uh-huh.
If they come from an EE background and they're excited about, the actual electrical theory of how these things are going, great. We're going to get you either on the DC or the AC side, and you become
Right.
kind of the specialist. Maybe you're really good with inverters, and that's what excites you. So that's where you become the
Uh-huh.
team expert there,
I love
where
that.
everyone can do the designs, but I'm really interested in crafting someone based on their kind of interested, their bent. And I'm fortunate. I'm lucky enough to have had a lot of experience in a lot of these different areas. So identifying that and putting someone in that area that excites them, I believe, I would argue, will increase their retention at our company. Retention is one of the biggest things
Yeah.
that's important because I don't want to train somebody and have them go elsewhere, especially if they're really, really good. So onboarding, training, keeping them excited, to me, that's what actually excites me as a people manager.
Are there concrete steps that as an industry we should be taking to address the shortage of the quality of qualified design engineers that you need to make the money? Because we got to scale the industry with more companies like New Leaf, which means more senior design engineers required to keep the design phase from being a bottleneck.
Yeah. So I think this comes in two different pathways. My background is in education. I spent
Mm-hmm.
14 years in academia training design engineers, right? So,
Right.
so to me, the education piece is critical.
Yeah.
So, advocacy in both directions is important. Universities are always looking for, making sure that their students are relevant to the industry later on, particularly technical schools. And I think that's the opportunity for industry to extend the olive branch to universities that are suffering tremendously right now in terms of constriction of student numbers and just dollars and cents of running programs. So it's a really good opportunity for industry to build a pipeline through universities to say, here are the things that we think are important. If you have an engineering program, perhaps sprinkle in these 3 or 4 different concepts, perhaps invite some speakers to come in, perhaps, have some job fairs to open the eyes of people who don't understand that this is even a career path option for them. And so I think I would argue it's a responsibility of
Mm-hmm.
industry to make that connection with universities who are always looking for this kind of information and give them, like genuine, critical, useful information of what would be important to bring into a curriculum. The number of people who would come into this field
Yeah.
who aren't thinking about it right now is just incredible. They just
That's
need
right.
the opportunity to see it. So, go out of your pathway, right? Don't go to like the standard, 3 or 4 places that you've already been, that you already go to, right? Extend that network out a little bit wider. Find those who might traditionally not be, looking at this type of an industry. There are some great, incredibly talented people that just need that exposure.
I wonder, given the sheer volume of projects that you guys are evaluating and designing, if there are things that you see that routinely pop up as common or really impactful miscalculations in the timeline of getting these projects through the risk mitigation process that you manage.
I would say what we see over and over again is a miscalculation of grading requirements on a site.
Ah,
It is by far and away, it's difficult it's expensive to get really good topography data. So there's a high cost of like establishing the baseline.
yeah.
It's difficult to do racking from a development perspective. Um, what we need to do is design a site that is buildable, but we can't guarantee which products
Hmm.
our ending EPC are going to use.
Right.
So if we do a concept of design on one racking type and our buyer might prefer a different racking vendor with slightly different civil tolerances, now we have to think about what our permit says of how much area we expect to degrade versus what is allowable.
Right.
And it's a really big cost miss that is had when you're not doing it internally from development all the way through construction.
Yeah.
So our civil team has a really difficult challenge of
Hmm.
establishing our baseline. Our design team has a really difficult challenge of picking the most flexible racking vendors as a basis of design.
Hmm.
And then if we start sprinkling things like a standard single axis tracker versus a terrain following
Right.
tracker, we now have a buyer risk of what our buyers like to use. So let's assume that as a designer, I were to say, hey, this is not a really great site from a terrain perspective. So terrain following trackers would be nice here because we can minimize site disturbance
Uh-huh.
that might be required in the local code. So
Yeah.
we design it based on a terrain following tracker site. But then our buyers, they don't want to use it. Maybe it's too high of an O&M or an installation cost, and or it's just a company they're not comfortable using for whatever reason. So they want to go back and redesign with standard single axis trackers that now your grading pile heights are way off, and they want to do more grading to make it viable, but it would violate the permit. Here we are.
Oh my goodness. Well,
Here we are.
that is complex. So the design team's design theory, as it were, can directly impact the outcome of a potential acquisition of the project.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It changes your buyer pool, but then we also have post-closing obligations or conditions where our company and our buyers kind of have a negotiation strategy to say, well, here's what you proposed, here's
Right.
what's actually in the ground. How do we do some like cost calibration to say like what you said versus what we actually had to
Right.
do?
Mm.
The more
Oh,
of those
interesting.
that are on a project, the more difficult it is
Right.
from lots of different reasons.
Yeah.
So from a designer's perspective, again, a really good designer intuitively understands those risks on the more constrained sites and
Yeah.
will still come out with a really flexible design. A new designer, this is a very difficult conversation to have. Um, and I don't mean that in a negative sense. It's literally a difficult thing to kind of wrap your head all around all at once. So it just takes some experience. But
Yeah.
that's our most common miss by far.
Well, Phil, I appreciate all of the stellar advice and insight that you've given. I don't know that I've ever done an episode where I've gotten this into the detail of how projects come together at the engineering level, and hope that we could do more content like this, and really appreciate being able to chat with someone right on the front lines, managing the engineering process. Often on Suncast, we're mostly in the sort of executive suite, and what happens down in the skunk works isn't always expressed from the C-suite chair. So Phil, appreciate you taking the time to illuminate us and to help folks that are really thinking about their career get a bit more grounded in what they need to do for themselves and what they can expect in the role.
Well, thank you for having me, Nico. Likewise, this is always great to talk about, and it's a good opportunity to, kind of discuss what we do as engineers. So, absolutely love being here.
Fantastic. If anyone wants to consider being a part of your team, what's the best way for them to find the open jobs and to connect with you?
They should on LinkedIn, Phil Hofmeyer on LinkedIn at New Leaf Energy. You
Mm-hmm.
should be able to find me. Probably the easiest way. And yeah, please reach out. Would be
Amazing. We'll link to
happy to
that. We'll
talk.
also link to the New Leaf Energy website for those who want to check out the company. Phil, thank you once again, and wish you guys all the best in this new year and with the challenges it presents.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun year. So thanks again, Nico, and looking forward to talk to you soon.
Likewise, we'll see if we can get some more senior engineers your way.
Sounds great. Love it.